Hilchis Mamrim Perik Sheni. Now in Perik Aleph we learned that Sanhedrin Hagodl, the Sanhedrin Hagodl, which was in Yerushalayim, that's the Amud Hira, and they are the authority b'negei Torah Shebal Peh. And therefore they are the ones that say what is Mipi Hashmua, what's the Kabbalah Mimeish Rabbeinu, what kind of dinim we learn out from the Midrash HaTorah and the Dreshes Bem, and Al Derech Zeh b'negei the Gzeiras Takonis Minhagos. And there's a mitzvah saseh to listen to them, and there's a mitzvah saseh if someone doesn't listen to them. Now, in this period, the Rambam will discuss what happens if there was something that was instituted by the Bezdin HaGadol, and then there was a Bezdin HaGadol of a later generation that argues with the Bezdin HaGadol of a previous generation. When could the Bezdin HaGadol of a later generation argue with the previous generation? When can't they argue with the previous generation? That's what we learn here. Perik Sheni. Bezdin HaGadol shedor shuba'achas min hamidas kifi ma shenire beineim shadin kach v'donu din. Because the Bezdin HaGadol came to the conclusion about a certain din based on the Midrash HaTorah and the Dreshes Bam. And then the Omid Achreim Bezdin Acher, the Nira Leitam Acher, Lister Din. And the second Bezdin, the Bezdin of a later generation, they argued with the previous generation, and they hold that you should be Seiser that this din is incorrect. So the din is Hareza Seiser. So the second Bezdin could be Seiser the din of the previous generation, and V'don Kefi Mashir Benev, and they could be paskin based on how they understand things. Shenemer al Hashefet Hashiyah B'yom Mahem Einat Chayav L'Leches El Bezdin Shebedercha. So even though when the first Bezdin paskin this din, so it became a psak din, and Mele it became a mitzvah saseh to listen to them, and a if you don't listen to them, or it became part of Torah, that became part of Torah Shebal Peh. But now, when there's a later generation, that later generation argues with the previous generation. So even though l'chura, the later generation isn't as great, certainly not greater than the previous generation, and maybe even not as great as the previous generation, nevertheless, Lepeil, since right now they're paskin, they hold the previous generation paskin, the Sanhedrin paskin, based on Akal V'chemer. And now the the Sanhedrin of the next generation holds that it's not a Kal V'chemer, that it's a Kal V'chemer that has a pircha, or they were paskin based on a Ma'atzah, the Mamatzinu, and they hold that you could argue with this Mamatzinu. So I'll call upon anyway, if Lepel, the Bezdin HaGadol paskin based on the fact that they understood this was from the Midrash HaTorah and the Dreshes Bam. And at that point in time, that was the Psak Din, had a Din of Torah Shebal Peh, and anyone that argued with them is arguing with Torah Shebal Peh, as we'll learn by Hemshech Azak and Mamrim. But nevertheless, if a later generation, the Bezdin HaGadol paskins differently, so the Din is like the Bezdin HaGadol that paskins differently, because that goes into together of Ein Atachayiv El Acher Bezdin Shebederch. Hashefet Hashiyah B'yom Meim. Halacha Beis. Now that's talking about when we're dealing with something that's from the Midrash HaTorah and the Dreshes Bam, and the second Bezdin is arguing with the first Bezdin, but again, this Psak Din that was based on the Midrash HaTorah and the Dreshes Bam. And vice versa, the Ram doesn't mention anything that they're arguing with the previous generation, Dvarim Shalom Dumepi Hashmua, like we mentioned before from the Sam Sefer, that is not shaykhs, that a later generation should argue with a previous generation, Dvarim Shalom Dumepi Hashmua, but Dvarim which lamdu me'achas me'amidah shater and dreshes b'hem, so that's a milsa d'talya b'svara, or something that they could argue with, so they could argue with it. Now, what about u'bezdin shegozru gzeira, a yeskinu takona, v'enhigu minik, and then this gzeira and takona minik has a teikev, because u'poshet kol adover b'chol Yisrael, like we'll learn b'hemshech, that if it wasn't poshet b'chol Yisrael, it really doesn't have a teikev, and it was poshet kol adover b'chol Yisrael. And now, v'omad achreim bezdin acher, ubikesh levatel divrei rishenim, v'laker esei atakona, v'esei agzeira, v'esei aminik, they want to uproot it, so we're going to learn later. If they only want to temporarily be mavatel it, that's beseder. But over here we're talking about they want to completely uproot that takona and that gzeira and that minik. So the din is eine yochel, ad sheyeh godel min harishenim b'chochma b'minyan. Unless they are godel min harishenim b'chochma b'minyan, so they cannot uproot, they cannot completely take away the takana rishena. However, hoye godel and that's this din. They have to be godel b'chachma b'minyan. Hoye godel b'chachma v'lei b'minyan, or b'minyan v'lei b'chachma. Eine yochel v'atlas dvarif. You have to be godel b'chachma u'b'minyan. Now, feel bottle time shebegloli gozer rishenim eiskinu is even the reason that they instituted this din was already bottled. Nevertheless, Eina achreinim yechelim levatel ad sheyu gdeilim mehem. Unless they're big gdeilim mehem, so they can't be mevatel. So according to the Ram, the Pashtus, it makes no difference if botla tam or not botla tam. Either way, if they are godel min harishenim, b'chachmu b'minyan, then they could be mevatel. And if they're not godel min harishenim and achachmu b'minyan, they cannot be mevatel. Now the Ravid argues on this Rambam on both nekudas. The Rambam holds that if botla tam, so then they can mevatel this takon or the gzeira, even if they're not godel b'chachmu b'minyan. That's the Rambam brings a raya. The Ravid brings a raya. And if they are, if the tam is not bottle, so then even if they're godel b'chachma b'minyan, then they cannot be mevatel. Nochamal. According to the Rambam, makes no difference if bottle tam or not bottle tam. Once the Bezna Godel instituted this gzeira takana or minik, the only way you can be mevatel it is only through a bezn, which is godel b'chachma b'minyan. Mashenk, if they're not godel b'chachma b'minyan, they cannot be mevatel. And if they are godel, they could be mevatel. Mashenk, the Ravid holds it depends. If the tam, the original tam is still intact, so even if they're godel b'chachma b'minyan, they cannot be mevatel. And if the original tam is not intact, so even if they're not godel b'chachma b'minyan, so then they could be mevatel. Now the Ram Meyask is saying that the second bezn has to be godel b'chachma b'minyan. So b'negei chachma you could understand to say that, like the Achrenim say, that the pshat is that the Reisha Sanhedrin of the later generation is greater than the Reisha Sanhedrin of the previous generation. But the question, how can you be godel b'minyan? V'heich yu gdelim b'minyan. Heil b'chol bezn u'bezn is the shel shivim v'echadu. The bezn HaGodel is always 71 people. So how could you have something that's godel b'minyan? So it means the minyan chachmi ader sheskimu v'kiblu hadavar shamru bezn HaGodel v'yichilku beit. In other words, we're talking about not the minyan of the people in Sanhedrin, because that's always the same. It means the minyan of the Chachmi Ader, which accepts the Divrei Sanhedrin. So if in the previous generation there weren't that many Chachmi Ader, which really accepted the Bezn HaGodel, Masha'inkin in this generation, the later generation, there's more Chacham in the Der, so then that goes into a Bezn, which is Godel B'Chachmi B'Minyan. That's what the Rambam says. Some say that the Godel B'Minyan goes on the Talmidim of the Bezn. It doesn't refer to the Chachmi Ader, but it rather refers to the Talmidim of the Sanhedrin. Now, b'medvar mamurim, when do we say? So basically, we're saying over here is that when there's a gzeira, takon, or a minig that the chacham instituted, if this later, the bezn of a later generation is godel b'chachma b'minyan, they could be mavatal this gzeira, takon, or minig. So that the Ram is saying b'medvar mamurim, when is it possible to be mavatal even if they're godel b'chachma b'minyan? That's only b'dvarim sheli osru esam kedei lasi syog. Because when they didn't answer something in order to make a siyog, lasi siyog, ela b'shar dini Torah. In other words, they instituted a gewisse din, but it wasn't an union of lasi siyog. They made a takon, a gzeira, but it wasn't lasi siyog. Aval dvarim shiro bezn, li gzeir a lesser esam, lasi siyog. If this was a gather of a siyog, asu mishmeres to mishmarte was a siyog l'teira, so then in Poshet Yisurim b'chol Yisrael, Ein bezn hagodl acher yochel la'okron la'tiron afil lahoya godl min harishenim. So now the Rambam is being magbal this din that bezn could be mevatel divri bezn harishenim if they're godl men b'chach b'minyan only if we're dealing with something which wasn't lasi syog. Mashenkin something that's lasi syog, so then it doesn't apply. Now a case of something that's not lasi syog, they give a dugma of l'moshel tfilas balkari, which the Chacham instituted was the Takona Derabanan, but on the other hand, Lepel was Nizbatel the Tfilas Balkari, but the Ram Paskins. But Lepel, that was also something, it wasn't Lasi Siyog, it wasn't like to prevent yourself from doing an Issa Deraisa, but those Takonas that Chacham instituted, for example, Basar Eif Bechol of the Ram is going to say, Behemshech, a case of a Derabanan, which was a Siyog, in order not to come to eat Basar Eif, Basar Behema Becholov. So therefore, that's something that, since it was a takana which was instituted last yog, so even if you have a bezna which is godel b'chachma b'minyan, they can be mavatal such a takana. Halacha dalet v'yesh lebezn laker av dvarim elu, but lefisha av al pishu kat min harishenim. So the Ram said before, you can be mavatal takanas and siyogim. First of all, the Ram said first, b'chalal if you're not godel mimenu b'chachma b'minyan. And if it's last siyog, so even if you let me manage b'chachma, you cannot. So here the Rambam was saying that even those things which were lasis yog. So be'etzem that you don't have a right, even if you gadol b'chachma b'minyan, in order to be mavatal. But that means to be mavatal permanently, to completely uproot it. Masha'enkin, to be mavatal it temporarily. So even if he's not gadol b'chachma b'minyan, even we're talking about a takana which was made lasis yog, they could also uproot it. They could uproot it temporarily. That's what the Ram is saying. In Nachamal, halacha dalet. V'yesh lebezin laker av dvarim eila. Dvarim eila means things that were gzeiros which were made lasis yog, lefisha, temporarily. Aval pi shekot min arishenim. Why? Shaliyog gzeiros elu chamurim midivritei atzma. These gzeiros which were made lasis yog cannot be more chamer than divritei atzma. And the din is, so here the Ram is saying something he didn't say before. Shafilu divritei yesh lechol bezin laker esem eirosho. So this is a new halacha that Bezdin has a right to be laker divrei Torah in the eifon of Eirosho, but only temporarily. So like the Ram Musa Mimayrech b'zeh. So the Bezdin has a right to be laker divrei Torah beHeirosho. So just like they have a right laker divrei Torah beHeirosho, so who adin they have a right to be laker a takona dirabonon which was made last yog is nachamol. Stam is a regular halacha which Bezdin learned from the Midrash Atir and the Veshes Bam, a Bezdin of a later generation could argue with, even if they're not Gadol b'chachma b'minyan. Then Masha'enkin, when we're talking about Takonis, Gzeiros, and Minhagis, they could only argue if it was Gadol mimenu b'chachma b'minyan. And it makes no difference whether or not Batal Atam or not Batal Atam, according to the Rambam. If they're Gadol mimenu b'chachma b'minyan, they could argue, and if it's not Gadol mimenu b'chachma b'minyan, they cannot argue. And then the Rambam says, however, gzeiros which were made lasis yog, so they can't argue even if they were gadol b'chachma b'minyan. And now the Rambam is saying that if we're talking about being mavatal temporarily, they could be mavatal. Now, Kate said, now the Rambam is saying that Bezdin has a right to laker even a divrei Torah lefisha. So Mamela certainly they could be laker a gzeira which was made lasis yog. Now, Kate said, what would be the case? That Bezdin has a right to do something laker divrei Torah if it's lefisha. So the Rambam gives a few examples. Ketzad Bezdin shiro lechazek hadas v'lasis siag kedei sheliyavru ha'omal divrei Torah. So there's a matzav that there's a necessity to do something in order to prevent people from being laver al divrei Torah. People were being too much aver al divrei Torah, so they have to do something which wasn't the shuras adin. The shuras adin is even if you aver al divrei Torah, in order to get malchus, you have to come to Bezdin, you have to have Asra, and you have to have Eidim, and Asra, and only that. Masha'enkin over here, since things were parrots, so Mamela Makin Shalekedin, Bezdin could go ahead and be Makin Shalekedin, Ve'en Shalekedin. Shalekedin means not based on the regular procedure of coming with Eidim and Asra, etc. Aval and Kevin Adaval Adeiris Ve'en Mishaloche Kachi. They're not saying that that's the Seder Advarim. They're saying right now, because of the Tzerech HaMatzav, that's what they're doing. V'chein, Imro lefisho levatel mitzvah sasei. If they saw lefisho levatel mitzvah sasei, a laver al mitzvah leisaseh, and the purpose was kedei lahachzer rabim ledas a kilahatzel rabim yisrael mili koshel b'dvarim acherim is oisim lefi mashashot tzricha. The Rambam doesn't give an example. The Rambam is saying a case where you could be mavatel a mitzvah sasei, you could be mavatel a mitzvah sasei lefisho. Ro lefisho levatul mitzvah asay. No, there's a musig l'moshel that Chacham have a right to be mevatul a mitzvah asay b'sheva al taisa, even not lefisho. L'moshel Chacham instituted that you shouldn't blow shofar on Shabbos because of the chash that maybe Shema Yavrenu Dal Rabbis. Over there, it wasn't lefisho. It was an institution. You don't blow shofar on Shabbos, so that's not levatul lefisho. Over here, the Rambam was talking about pashtus. Even bekum vasei, v'cheinem ro lefisho, levatul mitzvah sasei, elabra mitzvah leisaseh, kedei lahachzir rabim ledas, lehatzel rabim yisrael, milihikoshel bedvarim acherim, oisim lefi mashashot tzricha. The Ram gives an example, an explanation. Kshem sha'arei fechetech yodei raglish k'shelzeh, kedei sheyichye kulei. Sometimes you have to, Rachmana litzlan, amputate a certain part of the body in order for the person to be able to live. Is kav Bezdin moirin bizman min hazmanim, occasional bizman min hazmanim laver al mikzas mitzvahs lefisho temporarily kedei she is kaimukulam kederach shamru chacham rishenim that there's a musik called Chalal Shabbos Achas, Kedei Sheyish Shabbos Harbe, that's the Havana of the din of Pikuach Nefesh, Deiches HaShabbos, Chalal Shabbos Achas, Kedei Sheyish Shabbos Harbe. So the Rambam is saying also that the Chacham have a right to be Mevatel a mitzvah saseh, and even a lois saseh, which the Rambam gave an example of Bezdin, is makin, and they do things Shalei Kedin and Oinshin Shalei Kedin in order to make sure that the Torah is preserved. That's this din. And this din obviously is something which is only nimsar to Bez Nagodl. This is talking about the Rambam speaking about Bez Nagodl. Bez Nagodl has that right to institute this din. It's not something which people have a right to do. This is something which is a special din, which is only a din in Bez Nagodl. Is Nochmal. So the Rambam is saying over here that even though normally we say you can't be Mavatal, something that Bezdin instituted, which was in order to make a siyog, they can't do that permanently. But temporarily they could, because they could even temporarily institute something, levatel mitzvah saseh, or even laver al mitzvah leisaseh. Halacha hey. Bezdin shenira lehem ligzer gzeira, eletakim takona, elahanig minik. Bezdin holds that in their minds they should be geyser gzeira, to institute a takona, or to institute a minik. Tzichem li'syashiv b'dover. They have to think about it very much. And also, v'leida tchila im reiv hatzibur yichel lamed, or ein reiv hatzibur yichel lamed b'dover zeh. Ule'elam engaging gzeira latzibur, elim kein reiv hatzibur yichel lamed. So the Bezdin has to, first of all, think very strongly about the purpose of the gzeira, and also they have to assess whether they feel that this is something which the tzibur is yichel lamed. Because if the tzibur is ein yichel lamed, they can't institute a gzeira which reiv hatzibur is ein yichel lamed. They assume that Reva Tzibur is a Chel Lamed. And Lepel V'achar Shegozru Oisa. Pik Pikuham, but the Am wasn't really careful about it. And therefore, as a result of that, they pushed the Reva Tzibur, because it was too difficult for the Tzibur. So then is Harezuk Tel, it's Memela bottle. The Einon Rashoy Lokev Sa'am Lelechesba. So in other words, when does the Gzeira really have a din of a Gzeira? Only if it was pashta b'rei Yisrael. So that's why Be'emes L'Rambam in Halacha Daled, when he was speaking about you can't be mavatal a previous gzeira, that was only talking about a gzeira which was pashta b'rei Yisrael. A gzeira which wasn't pashta b'rei Yisrael doesn't really have a din of a gzeira. Now Goz Halacha Zayin Gozru v'dimu shepashta b'chol Yisrael. And v'omer hadover kein shana rabbis. The Bezdin assumed that it was pashta b'chol Yisrael. They made a gzeira. They assumed that it was pashta b'chol Yisrael. Ula'achas Mamrim after a long time. Is Ahmed Bezdin Acher Ubadak B'chol Yisrael V'ro She'ein Esak Zeire Pishatzis B'chol Yisrael. So we're saying a later Bezdin, in order to be Mavatal a previous Gzeira that was instituted, not so poshut. A regular Gzeira is only if they're Gadol B'chachma B'minyan. And a Gzeira which was instituted in order to a siyog, even if they're Gadol B'chachma B'minyan, also they can't. But by Medvar Mamurim, when we're talking about Gzeira, which was Taka Pashta B'rei Yisrael, and now they want to change it. But now this Bezdin of a later generation, a later Bezdin, Rosh She'ein Esak Gzeira Pishatzis B'chol Yisrael, is Yeshlei L'shus Levato. So they could be Mavatal this Gzeira, Afilo Hoya Pachis Meisi Bezdin Orishan, B'chachma U'b'minyan, is Yeshlei Levato, because they're not really being Mavatal, they're really being Megala, that it was never really Niskabel. Since they're being Megala, that it was never Niskabel, so Mela is Batul Mela. Now, V'chol Bezdin Shehita Shnei Dvarim, if a Bezdin comes and says that two things that are original Bezdin said they were matter, either they were matter it because Lepeil they were Gadol B'chachma B'minyan, or they were Megala that it wasn't a Spashet, but I'll call upon V'chol Bezdin Shehita Shnei Dvarim, Al Yimayr Lahatir Davar Shlishi. Because it's a Bezdin that looks like a Bezdin which are being matter things. Because you don't want that the Bezdin, in other words, even though Be'amas they are being matter because they hold, you're supposed to be matter it. Because they're not doing it als kalas chas v'sholom, they're doing it stop because they feel that really this gzeir shouldn't be. But on the other hand, since lepel ha'am, it looks like as if there's a Bezdin which are mikilim, so it's not good for the am to think that the Bezdin are just the Bezdin of mikilim. Halacha tes. Hail v'yesh lebezdin ligzer v'leser dover amuter. V'yamed isur l'deiris. Bezdin has a right to institute gzeiris, and that gzeira will stay l'deiris. V'chein yesh lam lahatir isur teira l'fisho, like we just learned, that Bezdin has a right to be matir isur teira l'fisho. Is ma'u zeh she'is hiro teira l'seisev olav l'sikrim imenu. We have a law that says you're not allowed to add to the teira, you're not allowed to take away from the teira. And here we're saying that Bez Nazarite ligzer gzeira, and Bez Nazarite also to institute to be matter something that's asr l'fisha. So the answer is that the lav is shalelehesav al divrei Torah v'leilegreya mehem ulekveya hadover le'elam. In other words, to institute that this is the halacha le'elam shehu min atera bein b'teira shebiksav bein b'teira shemalpeh, that they have no right. In other words, they have a right to go ahead and institute a takana and say clearly that it's not min atera. That's the lashon. That's so clear. The lashon over here. In other words, lekveya hadover le'elam shehu min atera. There's been a gear to add something to the Torah. They could really add something le'elam. They can make a gzeira that should be le'elam, but they have to say clearly that this gzeira is not a gzeira that's becoming part of Torah. It's a din d'Rabbanan, which they're instituted, which is not part of Torah. But again, to take away ligreya, then they could never do this le'elam. They could never do this le'elam. See, it's not so clear to read it. Shalei lehesev al divrei Torah. Now it'll be mesev al divrei Torah. V'lei ligreya behem and v'likveya hadover le'elam. Whereas when you're talking about ligreya, you're not allowed to be likveya davar le'elam, and shehum and atayr is going on lehoisiv. Lehoisiv, you're allowed to do le'elam, but you're not allowed to do it le'elam. Whereas likveya davar le'elam, that's shehum and atayr, to say that it's min atayr, bein shbetayr shebiksav, bein betayr shemalpeh. There's a difference between an es and a leisa, between adding and taking away. Taking away, you can never take away le'elam. Mashen can add, you could add lo'ilam, but when you add lo'ilam, you have to make it clear, like the Rambam will say, that you're adding it in a way that it's a dakana, not part of the Torah. The Rambam will teach you his ketzah. Harei kosev the Torah, le'sevashel gedi b'chalevimei. The pasuk says, le'sevashel gedi b'chalevimei. U'mepi ha'shmuel lamdu, shezeh ha'kosev osar levashel v'lechel b'osar b'cholav. Lav davke gedi and lav davke b'chalevimei. Beim b'sar behema, beim b'sar chaya, is all osir basar b'cholav. Aval b'sar eif, muter b'cholav min atera. So that's mipi hashmo. We know that even though it says le'savashel gedi b'chalev himei, so a person could argue and say maybe it's only a gedi, it's a rach, and also b'chalev himei. But nevertheless, we say no, that the isser is not only a gedi, it's b'sar behema, b'sar chaya, and also b'sar chaya, and it doesn't have to be dafke b'chalev himei, like we'll say. But on the other hand, Psar Eif is mutter b'cholav min atera. Now, im Yovi Bezin, v'yata b'osar chaya b'cholav, and Bezin is come along and say, Psar chaya is also mutter. Psar chaya is mutter, even though it's osir. So the din is harezi gereya. So he's being gereya an isur min atera, something that mipi hashmu we know that l'savash gedi b'chalev himei includes Psar chaya. So he goes into together where gereya is taking away something from the Torah. If he's if a bezin can come along and aser psaraif v'yemer shehu bechlal agdil and gdi, and who he's also aser min atera, is a reza mesif. So in other words, mipi hashmu we know that when it says l'savashul gdi b'chalevimei, it includes psar behema and psar chaya, and it doesn't include psaraif. So if someone's going to come along and says it doesn't include psar chaya, so he's being gereya. Someone says it is including psaraif, he's being mesif. Aval. If someone comes and says, Psar Eiv Bamis is mutter min atera. However, v'anu nesrei say, we're going to say that it's osir. V'nidir la'am shu gzeira. We're going to tell the am that it's not part of the Torah, it's a gzeira. And what's the reason for the gzeira? Shaliyavi min adover churva. So if the din is going to be that Psar Eiv is mutter, that could come out to be a problem. What's the problem? V'yemer, people are going to say, Psar Eiv mutter, why? Because it doesn't say the Torah Psar Eif. It just says the Savashal Gedi. So if Psar Eif is mutter, is Kacha Chayim mutter. Shaleinu Parsha doesn't say Chayim in the Torah. So people are going to start comparing and say, once we establish that Eif is mutter, so then Chayim is Eif is also mutter. Now once we establish that Chayim is also mutter, V'yavi Achar Leimer, not only Chayim is mutter, Psar Behema mutter. And the only thing that's Asr is only Mina Eis, only the Savashal Gedi. And v'yavi achar leimer af psara is mutter b'chalev hapara. Even if psara is a psar gdi is also mutter if it's chalev hapara yakifsa shalinamer eliime shehiminai. That only if it's the milk that comes from the same min. Masha'inkin milk that comes from a keves or from a para is not part of that min. That's what someone's going to say. And v'yavi achar leimer af b'chalev is ab'sha'inim imei mutter shalinamer eliime. So in other words, the pasuk says levashel gedi b'chalevimei. So lepel the din is that you're not mevatel and vashel any behema or any chaya and any cholof. That's the din. Not only b'chalev imei, also b'chalev kivsa, and b'chalev keves, and b'chalev para. You're not allowed to mevashel any basar and any cholav of these chalav. So you're not allowed to mevashel. However, the Chacham were concerned that if lepel will go according to the din, and the din is that psar eif b'cholav is mutter, so then people may think if psar eif b'cholav is mutter, so psar chayav eif is mutter. If psar chayav eif is mutter, so maybe psar behema, which is not gedi, is also mutter. And if it's mutter, so maybe also a psar in cholav, which is not chalev imei, if not the mutter, mine is also mutter. And even if it's mine, maybe if it's not mamish the mother, is also mutter. So bekitzer, it can come from one heter to another heter, which is all isurim. So mele, so therefore Chazal instituted that leisavashim diba chalev imei, even psar eif is also. The fichach neser kol basar b'cholav, v'afilu psar eif. And that was the reason for the takana, but the Chazal are telling you that it's takana. The Chazal are not telling you that's pshat in the pasuk. The Chazal are saying that that's the pshat, that's the reason for the takana, but it's only a takana. So ein zamesif elaesis siyog l'teire v'chein kol kiyetz b'zeh. This is an example of a siyog where the Chazal instituted that don't eat psar eif b'cholav, because we're afraid if you're going to eat psar eif b'cholav, you may end up eating psar basar b'cholav as well.